booked and then come take my hand. We're rebels with a paperback plan.
Welcome to Booked and Banned, the podcast, where we discuss essential literature that has faced challenges and censorship. I'm your host, Naomi. Our topic for this episode is City of Thieves by David Benioff. Our guest is Jen, whom I met through one of my many book clubs, though probably the book club with the most unusual membership. Jen, welcome to the show. Please tell our listeners a little bit about who you are.
Thanks for having me, Naomi. I am a West Coast transplant living in the DC area for well over a decade now. And of course, met you through book club that it was a coworker of mine that you know through not work, but professional circles. And it's the entire membership is that eclectic. In college, I studied Russian language and literature, among other things, and got a chance to live in Russia multiple times and live and study there, including St. Petersburg. We can get into it a little bit later, but that's part of why I picked this book. And in my spare time here, I like riding my bicycle around the beautiful trails in this area. There's so many great trails for bicycling and walking that are separate from roads, which is my favorite type of area to ride. I also sing in community choirs, and of course, as almost everyone in our circles, I love traveling to new places.
Great. So to set the stage for our conversation, let's take a look at the narrative of City of Thieves and the high-stakes mission that drives its two central characters. Originally published in 2008, City of Thieves is set against the brutal backdrop of the Siege of Leningrad during World War II. The novel follows two unlikely companions, Lev, a shy Jewish teenager arrested for looting, and Kolya, a charismatic Soviet deserter. Rather than facing execution, the two are given the impossible task by a Soviet colonel. They have 6 days to find a dozen eggs for the colonel's daughter's wedding cake. Their journey takes them behind enemy lines into the frozen, desolate Russian countryside. It is a coming-of-age story wrapped in a grim survival epic, exploring themes of friendship, the horrors of war, and the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the dark setting, the narrative is noted for its sharp wit and the evolving bond between the two lead characters. To provide some historical context, the Siege of Leningrad from September 1941 to January of 1944 resulted in the deaths of over 1 million civilians, primarily through systematic starvation and extreme cold. During the winter of 1941 to 1942, temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below Celsius, and the official daily bread ration for many was reduced to 125 grams, a food product supplemented with sawdust, cellulose, and wallpaper paste. This historical weight is an invisible third character in this book. While the book has been praised for its historical insight and storytelling, that same unflinching portrayal of the Siege of Leningrad has also made it a frequent target for removal from library shelves. The primary reasons cited for the book's removal or restriction include, first, graphic violence. The novel depicts the visceral realities of the siege, including cannibalism, torture, and the harshness of combat. Second, sexual content. There are explicit descriptions of sexual encounters and instances of sexual violence that have led some parents and school boards to label it, quote, pornographic or age inappropriate, unquote. And third, profanity. The dialogue, particularly from the character Kolya, is frequent and gritty, reflecting the military and wartime environment. Some notable instances took place in Florida, 2023-2024. In the wake of the expanded state legislation regarding school library materials, City of Thieves was among hundreds of titles pulled from shelves in districts like Clay County and Escambia County, pending oversight reviews, and Pennsylvania in 2022. The book was included in a list of challenged titles in the Central York School District, where a large batch of books focused on diverse experiences and history was initially frozen for classroom use before the ban was overturned following significant student and community protest. In general, City of Thieves is frequently targeted by groups advocating for, quote, parental rights, unquote, in education, who often categorize the book's adult themes as unsuitable for high school libraries, despite its frequent inclusion on best of lists for historical fiction. So, Jen, of all these titles that we could have explored, what was it about City of Thieves that made you want to discuss it?
I ended up picking this book primarily because it's set in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is the modern day name for the city of Leningrad. Was St. Petersburg during the Russian Empire, during the Soviet Union, was renamed Leningrad and then renamed after the fall of the Soviet Union. Because I've lived there before, there was a nostalgia element to it, and I always love reading novels set in places I've been or that I'm going to. That was a big part of it. I had read this book before a long time ago. I don't remember exactly when, but quite a while ago. But I didn't actually know it was a banned book. I didn't know it had been challenged or banned. So I thought, well, I would love to read a book about St. Petersburg, and I'm really curious. What is it about this book that lands it on challenged and banned lists?
The relationship between Lev and Kolya serves as the emotional anchor of the book. How does Benioff use their evolving friendship to examine the concept of heroism when the traditional structures of society and the military have not completely collapsed, but perhaps have devolved into chaos and unpredictability?
They're such a weird match, and they're not typical heroes. They're a product of their circumstances, and I know that's not. I know that's not unique to a hero journey, but
They're thrown together in an unlikely way on an unlikely journey. Guess I had expectations that Lev would be perhaps the more heroic of the two of them. But I think in the end, Kolya is more of a hero in some ways, or at least he is more willing to sacrifice himself for Lev's benefit than I think Lev might have been, at least initially, for Kolya's benefit.
and that's interesting because I agree that Lev definitely was not willing to sacrifice himself for Kolya at the beginning, but I didn't get the sense that necessarily that Kolya was either, unless I just missed something. Kolya has Big Brother energy, like 1984 Big Brother, but like he's like a big brother to Lev in many ways and takes him under his wing a little bit because Kolya's a little more aware of undertones of a situation. When they both walk into a new setting with new people, Kolya is clearly quicker to read the room and who's who, and not just because of any insignia on them, but he gets a sense for the people in the room very quickly, and Lev really does not. So in that way, he's kind of like a big brother. I love how much of a talker Kolya is. I don't know if I would love being around Kolya or a Kolya personality in real life because they can talk the pants off of anyone, but it was so fun to watch that happen, and especially through Lev's eyes in all of those situations. They seemed both an unlikely pairing and also in many ways because this was such an extreme situation. It's wartime, wintertime, they're under siege. The amount of desperation that has already set in 6 months in, they are both an unlikely pairing, unlikely heroes, but also what is unlikely at this point? I don't know how much of this has to do with the hero's journey because I see this a lot in a quote unquote hero's journey, but there's so much luck involved. There's so much bad luck with them ending up being in NKVD jail. There's so much bad luck involved with that. And then just the fact that they get through the journey. There's so much luck involved in that. And of course, they get themselves out of every situation they end up in. but there's a lot of luck in it. It's a hero's journey, but it's also just such a lucky journey too, and like, sheer force of will on their parts. But I guess they're used to that, they're 6 months into a siege.
Yeah, and that was something that I thought was really interesting is this is the beginning of the starvation and the deprivation. But I also think that you're right that Kolya had kind of a big brother in a kind way and not an Orwellian way.
Yes.
Compared to Lev, just because he is a little bit older. Lev is only 17. Kolya is more like 23, 24 years old. So he's a little bit older, a little more experienced. He's been in the Soviet army, even as a deserter, but he's been through training.
Yeah.
He does read the room more
So well.
so much better than Lev does, who seems a little bit sheltered in some ways, or had been by his family until his father died and his mother and sister moved to Moscow, hoping to escape the siege. But they're united in this mission. And so the mission to find 12 eggs is a classic MacGuffin, acting as a catalyst that propels Lev and Kolya into a series of dangerous situations. And we can talk about some of those situations. How does this mission highlight the bizarre, often cruel whims and total loss of perspective exhibited by those in power during a time of total war?
Each situation, right? I don't remember them quite in chronological order, but they go to the market and they're like, surely we can buy a couple of eggs at the market. There's nothing left in the city, which of course they quickly figure out. And so they're like, okay, I guess we're going to go on a journey. And then they're going to all their friends in the city, and
Yes.
a bystander overhears that they're looking for something and sees, oh, I can get that. You can come with me. And so they do. And both Lev and Kolya's spidey sense, and if Lev's spidey senses have kicked in, something's wrong, right? And even Lev admits that in the book. And then it turns out they're cannibals. And so Lev and Kolya have to fight them just to get out and survive. And there's so much just falling into a situation and having to fight and kill people, or at least fight and severely harm them just to get out and survive, then have to keep looking for these eggs. I think of all of these situations they get into, one of the ones that just makes me hurt emotionally the most is the rooftop chickens, where is a father or a grandfather figure who has these chickens that are laying some eggs, and so they're keeping them alive. So they try to go to buy the eggs, and there are no eggs to be bought, and there's only one chicken left, and the father or grandfather has already passed away, and there's the boy holding the chicken inside his coat, if I remember correctly. And so they buy the chicken off of him. Well, maybe the chicken can lay a couple of eggs. They have no sense of how many eggs a chicken can lay. I feel like there's a sense of pity in the purchase. I mean, there's a practicality of it too. And they spend, if I remember correctly, all the money that they have left for this mission on this chicken. Boy is clearly on death's doorstep. And it's just such a sad scene. And then back at the house later, a roommate comes home and is like, "That's a rooster." The moment he said it, I went, "Oh my God." I cried. They've spent all their money. They're halfway through the time frame they have to do this. And not that it would have changed the boy's outcome, but the father or grandfather passed away. The boy was clearly going to pass away as well. And just the sense of, how do you keep the will to keep doing this other than the will to survive, and to literally live? I think that's the one that hit me the hardest of all of these different situations that they end up in.
The boy, Kolya and Lev tell him to go downstairs to these young women that are living downstairs and that they would take care of him. It's clear that the grandfather died, and the grandson is so devastated by this loss that he's just following what the grandfather told him to do, which is keep the chickens alive. He feels his mission from his grandfather, but the grandfather's dead. All the chickens are dead. They buy the last one, which for me, when it's revealed that it's a rooster, that was a very comical moment.
I want to laugh, but I also just cry out of so much devastation.
Yes.
There's 4 days before the deadline. In an ideal scenario in modern modern times, a chicken will lay one egg a day. So there's no way that this one chicken, if it was a hen, would have laid a dozen eggs. It was going to lay maybe four. And that's if you're not taking into consideration that it's wartime and there's nothing to feed the chickens. If it was actually a hen, it probably wasn't laying eggs. Also, it's wintertime. It's all of the above. There is zero hope left and they've lost half their time.
Yeah. Well,
And then there's all the other things that happen after that. I
I
don't have the
do.
emotional bandwidth left for this book. This book's like 250 pages. Like, it's a short book. I don't have the emotional bandwidth to finish this, Naomi. What did I get myself into?
But there was so much more. But I do
I
think
know.
that
Yeah.
you're right that the death of the boy, because you know he's going to die.
Yeah.
He's not going to go down to the young women and have
He's
them
lost
take
the
care
will
of
to
him.
live.
He has lost the will to live. And so that, I think, was a very poignant moment in the text for me, even though I found the reveal of the rooster quite comical. It was great. Well,
In hindsight, it's so comical. And the character that delivers that knowledge, I believe, truly is actually laughing in that um scene.
yes.
Objectively, I know it's comical. I didn't have the emotions to laugh.
Right, right. Then after that, they start walking down the railroad tracks that no trains are running on into the countryside.
They're going to Mga, but then they are not going in the right direction.
Right. In this 872-day siege, it's often remembered through the lens of heroic endurance. But
Yeah.
the reality involved horrific survival tactics, including documented instances of cannibalism, which you've already mentioned that are in the
Yeah.
text, and the quote, road of life, unquote, across the frozen Lake Ladoga, which I don't think had really kicked in yet. But the Ladoga was the only way the people in Leningrad received supplies, since the roads and the railway access were blockaded, and the Germans, well, the Nazis really, had control over the airspace.
I was going to say they could only that lake, that road to life function in the wintertime. They were trucking the supplies in over the frozen lake and river. So it's not relevant to this story. It wasn't available in the summertime. So the summertimes all of it was rough, but the summertimes were very rough just because they couldn't get those supplies through.
So, how does Benioff's choice to frame this level of suffering, especially at the beginning of the siege, as kind of a fast paced quest style narrative, how does that impact the reader's ability to engage with the sheer scale of the historical trauma of over 1 million people who died?
Don't know why it works, but I know this is a very common storytelling method. We, as the reader, spend a week with Lev and Kolya, and it seems fast paced to us, but they spend a lot of time just walking through the snow. That's a couple pages of the book, but it's hours and hours. I think we, as the reader, it's up to us to remember. Oh, no, this isn't actually fast paced. The reality of what's actually happening, and that there's a lot of time between pages. The question reminds me of another Russian novel called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Solzhenitsyn. I believe it's a novel, not a novella, but it's another short work. Ivan Denisovich is in a labor camp in Siberia, and it is one day with him. I think there's a lot of parallels between that and this, even though this one's 1 week. In the case of the novel we read, City of Thieves, there's a lot of miniature adventures, but I also have to wonder, how much does it feel like an adventure in the moment? Like it feels like an adventure to me as the reader, but does it actually feel like that to the characters as they're going through it, until adrenaline kicks in when it becomes literally fight for your life? But until then, like, does it feel like an adventure to them, or is it just the constant running thought process of how are we going to find these eggs?
I definitely think it's like that for Lev. I think for Kolya, it might be a little bit of what are we going to get into next?
Yeah.
He seems more adventurous in his attitudes and the way that he reacts to situations. And Lev is much more counting off the days and how are we going to do this? And we're going to die because this Soviet colonel is going to kill us. It's an impossible task. When we look at the specific reasons this book is frequently pulled from school libraries, Often cited for its visceral descriptions of survival, it raises a question. How would the removal of such a raw portrayal of the past impact a student's ability to truly grasp the gravity of historical events, specifically the Siege of Leningrad?
Not being able to see and read or listen to or get to otherwise experience or know about stories like this, I think it gives a very one-dimensional understanding of how war plays out. When an army or when the military of a country decides to blockade an entire city and not let any supplies in or out and send a few aerial flights every day to drop a couple bombs, they're not really trying to conquer the city. That there's nothing merciful about that. I don't know how else that lack of mercy gets communicated other than through just showing how it truly plays out because this story seems wild and amazing, and this was typical. Anyone who was living in the city during the blockade, this was every day, just finding scraps to eat. There's nothing merciful about it. I almost want to say it's more cruel than bombing a city and trying to militarily take it over and control it. I mean, not that there's anything merciful about bombing a city and trying to take it over either. Just the sheer cruelty of it is wild to me. And I think we as humans need to know what the consequences of those choices are and truly understand that.
One of the mini adventures that Kolya and Lev get into is they come across a house in the countryside that is full of young women who have basically been forced into prostitution.
Yeah.
And the Nazis come every evening to visit, or most evenings, maybe not every evening. And the girls have to have sex with them and entertain them. And in exchange, they're actually fed and supplied by the Nazi, primarily officers, though not always officers. And for me, the point where I cried in this story, if we want to reveal those moments, was the
Yeah.
story about the young woman who tried to get
Yeah.
away and the Nazis cut her feet off. And the other girls were not able to keep her alive after
Yeah.
that happened. And it seems to me that, as you say, there's cruelty in firebombing. We've done Slaughterhouse 5 and talked about the firebombing of Dresden on this
Yeah.
podcasting. But there's also cruelty in using time to drag something out. When you've been firebombed, at least it's over
Yeah.
for a while. There may be more bombs that come later, but you have a little reprieve. With a blockade or a siege, there is no reprieve. And so I think that it changes the way that cruelty is enacted. And I would say that both of them have their own signature type of trauma that they leave on the individuals who do survive either a blockade or a firebombing. You're right. We can't say which one
Yeah.
is worse. I just think that they're different.
We as humans need to know that they're both bad and they both have terrible consequences. If I can take your question on a slight tangent, I was intrigued that one of the reasons for banning is the discussion of cannibalism. The reason I was so intrigued by that is because as a student who grew up in California, we learned about the Donner Party. And of course, this has nothing to do with war, but another example of clearly similar amounts of desperation of people to survive. And given the choice between dying or not, some people are willing to make that choice and others are not. And the Donner Party is discussed and taught about, and we don't spend a lot of time talking about how the people who did survive because they cannibalized, but that fact was never hidden. As an elementary school student, I was able to understand that it was a moment of desperation and having to choose between, am I that willing to try to survive? Is my want to survive that strong?
Right.
And as we saw with the Donner Party, sometimes yes and sometimes no. I see the same thing happen in this book too. Again, desperation. And some people were willing to cross that line and others were not. And I mean, as a reader, I certainly can't judge because I've never been anywhere close to that desperate to have to fight that hard just to live, have to make that choice. I'd certainly roll my eyes at that being one of the reasons that it's challenged because we see it and we can handle it. We should know that like sometimes it comes to that. There are many times throughout history it has come down to that question for other people, and that's just how history has played out.
Yeah.
And maybe
So
we should not make people have to make that choice. That was not, not imposed on the Donner Party, but when you're gonna cut off supplies to a city, like you're forcing that choice upon people.
you are. I was born and raised in Nevada, and
So yep.
seventh or eighth grade
Mhm.
history class was Nevada history. So we studied the Donner Party and we
Yep.
learned all about the cannibalism.
Yeah.
And I also think that as far as City of Thieves is concerned, the cannibals are punished.
They
Kolya
are.
and Lev send the police after them. The couple that was engaging in cannibalism and tried to make victims of Kolya and Lev and were unsuccessful in doing so, they are rounded up and they are punished. I find this idea that we have to ban this book because there's an instance of cannibalism, though those cannibals are roundly defeated, not once by Lev and Kolya getting away and inflicting some physical damage as they do so, but twice when they're rounded up and probably executed themselves. Isn't that the moral lesson that you would want around
Yeah.
cannibalism?
Although
Even
weren't
though historically that's not how it works.
although correct me if I'm wrong, but the officers that Levin Kolya reported the cannibals to at first weren't going to do anything about it. And then they only decided to act once they knew the name of the colonel that Levin Kolya were on a mission for. Not to take away from your point, but the police only cared to do something about it once they knew. The police didn't even understand the context of who Levin Kolya were to the colonel. They were just afraid of being reported to the colonel. The levels of chaos and the breakdown of structures just
Well, and I also
wild.
think that is a demonstration of kind of the Soviet state and its influence, which was Orwellian. We
Yeah,
would have to bring that in
that
someplace.
kind of Big Brother.
Yeah. The other kind of big brother. So, in the college level advanced composition classes that I taught on Russia, we examined the early 90s zeitgeist when the Soviet Union fell. There was this sense of quote unquote complete disintegration. It was a widespread feeling among newly minted former Soviets that the world as they knew it was fundamentally ending. This book often mirrors that same atmosphere of total societal collapse. Yet it frequently transitions between moments of profound tragedy and with dark, almost ridiculous humor.
Uh,
What does this tonal shifting tell us about how people endure prolonged trauma or a period where their entire reality is crumbling? And did you find those shifts bolstered the story or pulled you out of the moment?
to me, those shifts were very human. Make it such a human story. Everything is going so wrong on so many levels in the setting that Lev and Kolya are in, and that the city of Leningrad is in, and all the people in it, and any humans that are encountered in this story on all sides, right? Like so many things are going so wrong that when Lev and Kolya encounter the horrible story of these women who are essentially forced into prostitution for the German soldiers, they get to free them. That freedom comes with a caveat of who knows what's going to happen to them, and Lev or the narrator addresses this very explicitly. It might not be better. It might be worse in some ways, but it won't involve prostitution. But don't know if it's going to be better. It was probably for the better that they didn't go to Leningrad, which they talk about. If they don't know anyone there, they don't have any ration cards for the city. Even if they had ration cards, there probably wasn't anything for them to get with those cards anyways. Lev and Kolya get these little wins in the greater context of just all of this despair. And I just think that's a very human side of the story.
I do think that's one of the more humanizing moments in the story,
Mhm.
along with kind of the epilogue, which I will not go into. I really love that part of it. I don't want to spoil anything for anybody who should be reading this book.
We've spoiled
because
everything. We've spoiled so many things, but we will not spoil the epilogue. But
we're not going to say whether they get the eggs for the wedding cake or not. We're just not
we're
going to
not going to
say.
say.
Yeah. So, as we bring this episode to a close, what is one final thought or core message about this book that you want to leave with our listeners?
In a way, I feel like if the rest of our discussion hasn't sold you on the book, I don't know what will. It feels so weird to describe it as this, but it's such a that's such a fun story. The amount of talent it takes on the author's part to create a fun story out of such a truly terrible situation is really impressive without taking away from the awfulness. Maybe in my mind, that's all the things that this book gets challenged for are important to the story is because without those elements, without crass language, without the discussion of sex, consensual or non-consensual, right? Because to talk about both, but without talking about sex, without the crass language, with showing some of the truly dark sides of the desperation, the story isn't realistic. Hats off to the author for making it just a human story and really enjoyable and pretty short, but yet not lacking in things that are interesting.
I think you're lighting on the resilience of the human spirit, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the undertone of the entire story, or at least when we get to the end of it and come out the other side, that's what we
Yeah.
can see.
Half a spoiler, or it might touch on spoiling. One of the most emotional moments for me was, of course, when they're with the grandson on the roof with the chickens, or with the one remaining chicken. Right, that scene nearly did me in. But as much sorrow and just grief as I felt in that scene, I felt equal, if not more amounts of rage when sees the colonel at the end of the quest. The colonel is running through the inventory of goods that he has acquired for his daughter's wedding in a very casual way, mentions all the favors he had to call in to do this, almost as if it was a burden to him to call in the favors to get all of this food that he's showing in front of someone who nearly lost his life 7 different times over the last 7 days trying to complete this journey. I almost had it with just that, right? With just the inventory that he's doing in front of Lev,
Right.
and without even seeming to care about he's doing that. And then one of the other soldiers who's like doing part of the inventory calls out that they have like 3 dozen eggs. And Lev is like, what the hell? I thought you needed a dozen eggs. You sent me on this whole journey for a dozen eggs. And you have 3 dozen here? Lev clearly emotionally reacts, as we can see, because we're in Lev's head. But the fact that that was it, like, oh man, you have a better survival instincts than I would have, because I would not have been surprised if he had tried to stab the colonel or something, which surely would have ended in his death. He would not have survived the scene if he had tried anything. But I would not have faulted him for it, because, oh my God, that colonel has no idea. That's such a common theme in Soviet stories, and not just Soviet stories, so many stories, right? Just of someone who has power and privilege having no clue how much privilege. They understand the power they have. They have no idea how much privilege they have and how much access to resources they have. And Lev, hats off to you for not expressing his rage in some form or fashion.
And the colonel doesn't even like the man that his daughter is going to marry. So that's a whole nother thing that we won't even go into. So, Jen, thank you so much for all of your insights and for a great discussion. This is our 20th episode and the end of season 1. We'll have a short break, and our next season will begin with a discussion of The Yellow Birds by Kevin Powers. Thank you for joining us. As Isaac Asimov said, any book worth banning is a book worth reading.
Booked and banned and bound by pages, stories hiding through the ages, whispered truths that still ring clear for those who choose to listen here. Booked and banned, we take a stand, turning words into common ground. Booked and banned, come take my hand, we're rebels with a paperback plan. A coffee ring, a dog-eared fold, the pain.